The day Harriet Covington rode into Caldwell, Kansas with nothing but a split lip, a borrowed horse, and a shotgun across her lap was the day Elias Fairchild decided that some women were simply not to be trifled with, and he was absolutely right about that. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle trails were still bleeding men dry with their promises of fortune and freedom, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a wound that never quite healed. The main street was mud when it rained and dust when it did not, and it smelled of horse sweat and wood smoke, and the particular desperation of people who had come west expecting something better than what they had left behind. Saloons flanked the general store. The sheriff's office leaned slightly to the left, as if tired of holding itself upright. The barber shop doubled as the dentist, which told you everything you needed to know about the town's relationship with suffering. Harriet had been riding for 3 days. Her dark hair, which she usually kept pinned with a precision that bordered on stubbornness, was loose around her shoulders and tangled from the wind. She was 26 years old, which in Kansas in 1878 meant she had already buried a husband, survived 2 brutal winters, and learned to read a man's intentions before he even opened his mouth. She was not fragile, had never been fragile, and the split lip she was currently sporting was not evidence of fragility, but rather of the fact that she had, in fact, gotten away from a situation that most women would not have gotten away from at all. She tied the borrowed horse to the post outside the general store and walked in with her shotgun resting in the crook of her arm like it belonged there, because it did. The man behind the counter, a round-faced fellow named Burkett, looked up and took in the whole picture of her in about half a second, and had the good sense to say nothing about any of it. "I need salt, cornmeal, a length of rope, and any mail that might be waiting under the name Covington," she said. "Yes, ma'am," said Burkett. She was paying exact coins counted out because she had learned to count everything exact when she became aware of someone watching her from the far end of the store. Not the predatory watching she had learned to recognize, the kind that made her fingers tighten on whatever was nearest. This was a different sort, more like the careful attention of a person trying to determine whether a situation required their involvement. She turned and looked directly at the man before he had a chance to pretend he had not been looking. He was tall, somewhere in the range of 30, with a face that had been weathered enough to look honest and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. He wore the clothing of a working cowboy, dusty boots, canvas trousers, a sun-bleached shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and a hat that had clearly been rained on many times and never quite recovered its original shape. He had brown eyes, which she noticed only because he was not looking away when she looked at him, and most men looked away. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, and her voice had that particular tone she had cultivated over years of being a woman alone, which was pleasant enough to pass for civil and hard enough to discourage nonsense. "No, ma'am," he said. "I was just noting that the horse you came in on belongs to Marta Ellison, who lives about 12 miles east, and I was wondering if everything was well with her." Harriet blinked. That was not what she had expected him to say. "Marta Ellison is fine. She lent me the horse. I will return it tomorrow." "That is good to know," he said. "Marta is a good woman." He tipped his hat, picked up the sack of feed he had apparently come in for, and walked out. The door swung shut behind him, and Harriet stood there for a moment with her exact coins in her hand and a strange feeling in her chest that she could not immediately name. It was not attraction, or if it was deeply inconvenient. It was more like the feeling of having expected a door to be locked and finding it open. She bought her salt and cornmeal and her length of rope and collected the letter that had indeed come for her under the name Covington. She did not open it until she was outside, squinting against the afternoon light. It was from her sister in Missouri, full of news about a new baby and an invitation to come home, and Harriet folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and thought about what home meant when you had made several and lost them all. She needed a place to stay. She had enough money for a week, possibly 2 if she was careful, and she needed that week to figure out what came next. Caldwell had a boarding house, which she found without difficulty, run by a woman named Mrs. Aldridge who charged $2 a week for a room and meals and asked no questions, which Harriet appreciated enormously. The room was small and clean, with a window that looked out over the back garden and a bed with an actual quilt, and Harriet sat on the edge of that bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of the last week before she folded it away somewhere internal and practical and stood up and started thinking about what to do next. She had a plan, or the beginning of one. Before her husband Thomas had died, they had been working toward buying a small piece of land on the eastern edge of the territory. Just good soil, nothing dramatic, enough to grow enough to live on. Thomas had died of a fever 2 years ago, quick and unkind, and the land had gone to pay debts she had not known existed, and she had spent the following 2 years working as a seamstress, a cook, a school teacher in a town that could barely afford to have one, and she had saved, carefully and relentlessly, until she had enough to try again. The trouble 3 days ago had been a man named Dalton Reese, who had decided that a woman traveling alone with money was an invitation. He had been wrong about that decisively, and she had the borrowed horse and the split lip to prove it. She had not been hurt badly. She had been fortunate, and she knew it, and she did not dwell on that particular fortune because dwelling led to fear, and fear was not something she could afford right now. The next morning she was up before the sun, dressed and practical, and she went to the land office to ask about available parcels and was told to come back when Mr. Harding was in, which would be Thursday. It was Tuesday. She spent Tuesday afternoon in the boarding house mending, because she had brought her sewing kit as a matter of course, and she had offered Mrs. Aldridge to mend in exchange for a slight reduction in board, and Mrs. Aldridge had accepted on the spot. Wednesday she walked the town with a purpose, because she had learned that the best way to understand a place was to walk it without looking like you were studying it. She was studying it. She went to the livery to arrange returning Marta Ellison's horse, and it was there, in the dim, sweet smell of hay and horses, that she encountered the man from the general store again. He was brushing down a roan horse with the kind of focused attention that people give to things they love, long, even strokes, talking softly under his breath in the way you talk to animals when you were not thinking about whether anyone could hear you. He looked up when she came in. "Marta's horse," she said, indicating the animal she was leading. "I can see that," he said. "I will make sure it gets back to her. I am riding out that direction this afternoon." "That would be helpful," she said. "Thank you." She started to turn and he said, "You are staying at Mrs. Aldridge's house." She stopped. Not because it was threatening, there was nothing threatening in his voice, but because she was deciding how to respond to information being offered back to her when she had not offered it first. "I am," she said. "Elias Fairchild," he said, and offered his hand across the roan's back, a gesture that was slightly awkward given the horse was between them, but earnest. "Harriet Covington," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm but not performative. She appreciated that. "You are looking to buy land," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am looking at my options," she said, which was technically true. "Harding at the land office is honest enough," Elias said, returning to his brushing. "He is slow and he likes the sound of his own voice, but he will not cheat you. The trouble is knowing which parcels are worth looking at and which ones have been dressed up to look better than they are. You want to see the water. If there is no reliable water, the land is not worth what they will ask for it." Harriet looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" He did not stop brushing. "Because you look like someone who makes her own decisions, and I thought the information might be useful. I have no stake in what you do with it." She stood in the doorway of the livery for a moment longer, the spring sun warm on her back and the dim, cool air of the stable in her face. And she thought about Thomas, who had also seemed straightforward, and had turned out to be carrying a mountain of debt in silence. And she thought about Dalton Reese, who had seemed harmless right up until he was not. And she thought about the particular economy of trust, and how much it cost to extend it, and how little you got back when you had extended it wrong. I do not trust cowboys, she said. She said it plainly, without apology, the way she had learned to say true things. Elias Fairchild stopped brushing. He looked at her, not with offense or surprise, but with something more like recognition, as if she had named something he had expected to find there. "That is fair," he said. "I have not earned it yet." And then he went back to brushing the horse, and Harriet Covington stood in the doorway for one more moment, thrown off balance by the absence of the argument she had been bracing for, and then she walked back out into the spring sunlight. She thought about what he had said for the rest of the day. Not because it was charming, though it had been, in a quiet, unassuming way. She thought about it because of the word yet. Not "I understand," or "that is reasonable," or any of the usual deflections that men produced when they wanted to appear gracious while actually dismissing the concern. He had said yet. He had acknowledged that trust was something built over time, and that he was, as of this moment, at the beginning of that process. It was such an honest and simple response that it took her until evening to fully process it. She met Thursday with her most serious expression and presented herself to Mr. Harding at the land office, who was indeed slow and did indeed love the sound of his own voice, and she sat through 40 minutes of his thoughts on territorial expansion and railroad development before he finally showed her the available parcels. There were 3 within reasonable distance of town. One was clearly overpriced, and she said so without hesitation, which surprised him. One had a creek on the eastern edge that was described as reliable, and she made a note of it. One was flat and unimpressive, and she could not see a reason for it. "I would like to see the one with the creek," she said. "In person, not on paper." "I can arrange for someone to take you out there on Friday," Harding said. "I can arrange to go myself," she said. "I just need the exact location." She got the location. She went back to Mrs. Aldridge's, and in the morning she borrowed a horse from the livery, a steady brown mare named Belle, who the livery man told her was gentle and reliable, and she rode out to see the land. She found it without trouble. It was about 4 miles east of Caldwell, rolling grassland with a line of cottonwood trees that marked the creek Harding had mentioned. She got down off Belle and walked to the creek and crouched beside it and put her hand in the water. It was cold and clear and moving. She looked at the soil, which was dark and good. She looked at the shelter potential, the natural windbreak the trees would provide, the slight rise of the land to the south that would protect against the worst of the weather. She stood up and turned slowly, looking at all of it. She heard a horse and turned around. Elias Fairchild was sitting on his roan at the edge of the property, and he raised one hand in a sort of acknowledgement. "Mr. Fairchild," she said. "Miss Covington," he said. "Or Mrs." "Mrs.," she said. "I am a widow." "I am sorry," he said, and it sounded like he meant it. "Are you following me?" she asked. "No," he said. "I run cattle on the property that borders this land to the north. I ride this fence line most mornings." He paused. "I can go a different way if you would prefer." She thought about it. "Did you know I was coming here today?" "I did not," he said. "I knew you were thinking about this parcel. I did not know when." "What do you think of it?" she asked, because the information was useful, and she was practical enough to use useful information when it came from someone who likely knew the land better than she did. He dismounted and walked his roan over to where she was standing by the creek, and he looked at the water and the cottonwoods and the soil the way she had, with the careful attention of someone reading something important. "The creek is reliable in summer, which is rare around here," he said. "It runs from the spring about a mile north on the property I work on. The soil is good. The parcel is 12 acres, which is enough to grow a household garden and maybe a small crop of corn if you work it right. The trouble is the south fence, which is old and will need replacing before you can keep animals." He looked at her directly. "What are you planning?" "A house," she said. "A garden. Maybe a small herd of chickens to start. I know how to manage land. I have done it before." "Where?" "Missouri, then Colorado," she said. "My husband and I were working towards something. When he died, I lost what we had built. I'm starting over." She said it factually, not bitterly, though there was a layer of something harder underneath the facts that she thought he could probably hear. He did not press on it. "It is a good piece of land," he said. "The price Harding is asking is fair. Not a bargain, but fair." "Good," she said. She bought the land on Friday. She signed the papers with her whole name, Harriet Ann Covington, and she paid with the money she had been carrying in a flat pouch sewn into the lining of her coat. And she walked out of the land office holding the deed in both hands with a feeling in her chest that was so large and so complicated she could not decide whether it was joy or terror or something that was both at once. She owned 12 acres. She owned something that could not be taken back by a dead man's debts. She owned ground. She stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878, holding her deed, and she cried, briefly and without embarrassment, and then she wiped her face and went back to Mrs. Aldridge's to start planning. The planning was extensive. She had enough money left for materials to begin a small structure, something more modest than what she ultimately wanted but solid enough to get through a winter. She had skills. She could build what she could design, with help, and she began making a list of everything that needed to happen in order. She was sitting with her list at the kitchen table in Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house when Elias Fairchild appeared at the back door with a question about whether Mrs. Aldridge had any spare nails, because he was mending something at the livery. Mrs. Aldridge pointed him toward the shed and then invited him for coffee because she was that kind of woman, and Elias Fairchild sat down across from Harriet with a mug of coffee and looked at her list upside down. "That is a lot of lumber," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you have someone to help you build?" She looked up from her list. She had been expecting this moment and had already decided how to handle it. "I will hire someone," she said. "I am told there is a man in town who does carpentry." "Franklin," Elias said. "He is good, but he is expensive and he is in high demand. You might be waiting a month or more." "I am aware," she said. He wrapped his hands around his mug. He had good hands, she noticed, the kind that showed their work calloused and capable. "I can help," he said. "I know how to build. The ranch I work on, I have helped raise 2 of the outbuildings myself." "I cannot pay you what Franklin charges," she said. "I am not asking to be paid," he said. "I have time in the mornings before the afternoon work begins. I am not doing you a favor. I want to be clear about that. I am offering because I think you are doing something that deserves to happen." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes steadily, which had become a thing she noticed about him. Most men, when she looked at them with that particular directness, shifted or deflected. He did not. "I told you I do not trust cowboys," she said. "You did," he said, "and I told you that was fair. I have not earned it yet," a slight pause, "but I would like the chance to try if you will let me." It was, she thought, an extraordinarily careful way of putting it. He had not pushed. He had not made a case for himself as an exception to her distrust. He had simply asked for the opportunity that trust was built on, which was proximity and time and the accumulating evidence of consistent behavior. She thought about it for 3 full days, during which she began walking out to her land every morning to get a sense of what the sunrise looked like from different angles and where the wind came from. She thought about Thomas, who had been warm and loving, and still managed to lie to her by omission for 3 years of marriage. She thought about the fact that she was 26 years old and owned 12 acres of good Kansas land, and that the world was significantly harder than it needed to be when you were doing everything alone. She went to the livery on Monday morning and found Elias repairing a harness with the same focused attention he gave to everything. "If you want to help," she said, "I will accept that, but I make my own decisions about everything on my land. I want your labor, not your opinions." He looked up. His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Understood." "We start Wednesday," she said, "at first light." "I will be there," he said. He was. He was there before first light, actually, standing at the edge of her property in the gray pre-dawn with his horse tied to one of the cottonwood trees, and a collection of tools laid out on the ground with a methodical care that suggested he had been thinking about this. She arrived as the sky began to go pink, and they looked at each other for a moment across the dew-wet grass. "You are early," she said. "I did not want to be late," he said. They worked hard that first day, driving stakes and measuring and discussing the layout of the foundation. She had a design she had been working on for years in her mind, practical and solid, a rectangular structure with a separate cooking area and a sleeping loft, and a covered porch on the east side to catch the morning shade. She explained it and he listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and then he asked 3 questions, all of them practical and none of them dismissive, and she answered them, and they adjusted 2 things based on his knowledge of the specific angles of wind across this particular piece of Kansas, and she was satisfied. They did not talk much as they worked. They were both people who understood that work was its own language, and that filling silence with words that did not need to be said was a kind of waste. She found herself noticing things about him with the peripheral attention she could not seem to turn off. The way he moved was efficient, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. When he disagreed with her choice of a particular position for the first post, he said so directly, and explained why, and then did not press it further when she considered and disagreed. She had been right, as it turned out, and she could see that he acknowledged this without requiring a performance of it. By the end of the first week, they had a foundation laid and the beginning of 4 walls. She had established a rhythm of working alongside him that felt, in its best moments, natural, and in its worst moments only slightly uncomfortable, which was better than she had expected. He brought her coffee one morning, just appeared at the edge of the property with 2 tin cups, having apparently stopped at the diner on his way out. She took it without much ceremony, because it would have been silly not to, and they sat on the half-built wall in the morning sunlight, and she said, "Tell me about this ranch you work on." He talked about it easily, without the posturing she often heard from men discussing their work. The ranch was called the Double H, owned by a man named Garrett Holloway, and Elias had been working there for 4 years. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee originally, following the cattle work north after the war had disrupted everything it could reach. He was 30 years old, she learned, and he had been a cowboy for most of his adult life, which meant he had spent years on the trail and knew exactly the kind of life that produced and exactly the damage it did. "Have you ever thought about doing something else?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without elaborating immediately. She waited. "I have been saving," he said. "I have a plan. It is slower going than I would like, but it is moving." "What is the plan?" He looked at his coffee cup. "Land," he said, "not working someone else's, my own, something I can put my name on and have it mean something permanent." She understood that. She understood it so precisely that it caused a small and unexpected ache somewhere under her ribs. "Why Kansas?" she asked. "Because the land is still becoming what it is going to be," he said. "It feels like a place where what you build actually belongs to you. Back east, everything belongs to someone who already had it." She nodded slowly. That was more or less exactly what she had thought, and the fact that he had arrived at the same conclusion by a different road was interesting to her. The way parallel lines that never meet were still interesting. He left when the afternoon grew hot and the light was wrong for careful work, and she stayed another hour just looking at what they had built and thinking about the fact that she had not thought about Thomas today. Not once, which was unusual. The weeks passed in the particular way that weeks pass when you are doing something that matters. She fell into a schedule. Mornings she worked on the house with Elias, who was consistently early and consistently useful, and never once told her she was doing something wrong without first explaining exactly why it was wrong, and then deferring to her final decision. Afternoons she returned to town, to Mrs. Aldridge's, or to the general store, or the occasional visit to the post office, where letters from her sister continued to arrive full of Missouri news. She began to understand what the town was. Caldwell was a border town in every sense, the border of the territory, the border of the cattle trail, the border between what was becoming settled and what was still wild and unresolved. There were people here who had come with good intentions, and people who had come with no intentions at all, and people who had arrived without choosing to, brought by circumstances they had not controlled. She noticed that the cowboys who came through on the trail were often very young and often very tired, and that the glamour of that life was not visible in their faces up close. She noticed the few Cherokee families who lived on the edges of town and were treated, by most of the white population, with an indifference that was its own kind of violence, and she was aware that she had no standing to fix this, but that awareness was something, at least. There was a woman who came into the boarding house for a meal one evening named Clara Boone, who was traveling with her husband and 2 children toward Indian Territory to try to establish a farm. She was Harriet's age, with a quality of exhausted determination that Harriet recognized immediately, and they talked for 2 hours while Clara's husband and children slept, and Harriet learned that Clara had been doing this, moving and building and losing and starting again, for 7 years. It made Harriet's 2 years of difficulty feel both more and less significant. "Do you trust your husband?" Harriet asked, and then apologized immediately because it was intrusive. Clara did not seem to mind. "Mostly," she said. "We have been through enough that I have seen who he is when things are bad. That is the only way you really know, I think." Harriet thought about that. She had seen who Thomas was when things were bad, or she had thought she did, but what she had not seen was who he was when he was keeping things from her, and those were different tests. She was thinking about this the next morning when Elias arrived at the property with a load of additional lumber in a borrowed wagon, and instead of saying good morning she said, "What is the worst thing you have ever done?" He set down the boards he was carrying and looked at her with a surprise that was unguarded, which she had come to understand was a reliable indicator of how he actually felt about something. "That is not a typical greeting," he said. "I know," she said. "You do not have to answer." He was quiet for a moment, picking up the boards again and carrying them to where they were building the east wall. He set them down and then he sat on the pile and took off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I left a man behind once," he said, "on the trail. He had been hurt, a fall from his horse, and we were 3 days from any town and the drive could not stop and the trail boss said we had to keep moving. I told myself there was nothing we could do for him that he could not do for himself if he had water and time. I told myself that." He looked at his hat, which he was turning slowly in his hands. "He died. We heard about it a month later. I think about it more than I like to admit." She looked at him. "You were following orders," she said. "I was," he said. "That does not mean I was right." She nodded slowly. She believed him, which surprised her a little. Not because she had expected him to lie, but because the story was specific and self-condemning, in a way that invented stories never quite managed to be. The details were wrong in the particular way that true memories were wrong. "What is the worst thing you have done?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that was careful, the understanding that this was a door that swung both ways and he was not going to stand outside it while she walked in. She thought about it. "I let my husband carry something alone because I was angry with him for something unrelated," she said. "He had come to me once early on, trying to tell me about the money problems. I was in the middle of something else and I was sharp with him about the timing. He never tried again. When he died and I found out the full extent of it, I understood that I had closed a door with my sharpness and he had been too proud or too afraid to open it again." She paused. "I have had to live with that." He looked at her with an expression that she could not fully name, something that was neither sympathy nor pity, but more like the recognition of a person seeing their own experience reflected accurately in another person's telling. "That is a heavy thing to carry," he said. "It is lighter than it was," she said. "I think that is what time does with things. Not make them smaller, just make them possible to carry." They worked that day in a different silence than the silences before, one that had something more settled in it. She was not sure what had shifted, only that something had. The house walls went up in the last week of May. They were not perfect, because she was not a professional carpenter and neither was he, but they were solid and true, and she stood outside on the day the last wall was raised and felt a satisfaction so pure it was almost painful. "Roof next," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you for all of it." He looked at her with that steady brown gaze. "You built this," he said. "I just handed you things." That was not accurate, and they both knew it, but she understood that he was saying something more than the literal words, which was that he had not built it for her but with her, and that the distinction mattered to him. A thing had been happening between them gradually enough that she could not have pointed to the moment it began. She was aware of where he was when they were working. She was aware when he laughed, which was infrequent but genuine when it happened, a low surprised sound as if he were consistently slightly amazed that something was funny. She was aware that he had started bringing her coffee every morning and that she had stopped mentally categorizing this as a thing to be cautious about and started simply accepting it as coffee. One afternoon in early June it rained, a sudden hard rain that came off the prairie with almost no warning, and they were caught out on the property without adequate shelter, the roof being only half finished. They ran for the cottonwood trees by the creek, which provided some cover, and stood close together under the spreading branches, with the rain coming down around them in gray sheets, and the smell of wet grass and wet earth rising up around their feet. She was close enough to him that she could feel the warmth of him, and she was aware that she had not been this close to another person in a long time, not in a way that felt voluntary and wanted. He was looking out at the rain, and she was looking at the side of his face, and she thought about how strange it was that you could be standing in the rain on 12 acres of your own land in Kansas in 1878, next to a cowboy you did not trust 3 months ago, and feel, for the first time in years, that you were standing in exactly the right place. He turned and found her looking at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Harriet," he said, and just the word was careful, like he was testing how it sounded. "I know," she said. "I have not said anything." "I know," she said again. He looked at her for another moment and then looked back out at the rain, and she watched something in the line of his jaw, a kind of decision being made, and she thought about how much she had liked him for being patient and how much she did not want that patience to be the whole of what this was. "Elia's," she said. He looked at her. "Have you earned it yet?" she asked. Something changed in his face, subtle but total, the way light changes when a cloud moves. "I do not know," he said honestly. "That is your determination to make." She thought about everything she had observed over the past months. The consistency of him, the days he showed up in cold that would have given most people a reason not to, the way he had never once made her feel that her decisions needed his approval, the story about the man on the trail and the honesty of its telling, the coffee, the rain, the solid walls of a house she had built with her own hands on land that was hers. "I think you are getting closer," she said. His breath came out slowly, like something released. "I will take that," he said. The rain came down and they stood under the cottonwood trees, not quite touching, not quite not touching, and when it stopped they went back to work on the roof as if nothing had happened and everything had changed. The roof was finished in mid-June. They did it in 2 long days, and on the second day half of Caldwell seemed to have decided to show up and help, because that was the way of frontier communities, where the work of one was eventually the work of everyone. Mrs. Aldridge came with food. Burkett from the general store came with extra shingles he had been holding in reserve. A man named Hector Torres, who was one of the vaqueros at the Double H Ranch and whom Harriet had met in passing, came and proved to be the best roofer among all of them. Even Mr. Harding from the land office appeared briefly, less to help and more to observe, but she appreciated the gesture. By the end of the second day the roof was on and the house was, structurally, a house. Not finished, not comfortable, not a home yet, but a house. She stood inside it as the sun went down and looked at the 4 walls and the roof, and the light coming through the 2 windows she had insisted on, one east and one west, so that the whole day of light could move through the space she lived in, and she felt something crack open in her chest in the best possible way. Elia's was the last to leave. Everyone else had gone and she was sweeping the floor, which was actually sweeping it for the first time and was therefore an act of hope, and he came to the door and looked at her. "I should go," he said. "Garrett needs me at the ranch early tomorrow." "Yes," she said. "It is a good house," he said. "It is," she agreed. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and she was aware of the particular quality of evening light at that time of year in Kansas, which came in low and golden and made everything look like the answer to a question you had not known you were asking. "I would like to call on you," he said. "If that is acceptable, properly. Not to help with the house, but to call on you." She stopped sweeping. She looked at him in the golden evening light with his hat in his hand and his careful, direct eyes, and the 6 months of consistent, unremarkable, steady behavior that had built itself into something she could not dismiss. "Yes," she said, "that is acceptable." He nodded the way he nodded when something important had been established, a single precise movement that meant he had understood and would honor the thing that had been said. "Sunday, then," he said, "if that suits you." "Sunday suits me," she said. He put his hat back on and walked out into the evening, and she stood in her new house and listened to the sound of his horse moving away, and then the quiet of the prairie, which was not really quiet at all, but was full of grass sounds and wind sounds, and the particular music of a creek running clear and cold over stones in the last light of the day. She moved into the house the following week. It was an event she marked by sleeping there for the first time on a Thursday, on the bed she had had the livery man haul out from Mrs. Aldridge's, wrapped in her own quilt, in a room she had built, on land she owned, and she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular and uncomplicated peace of a person who has arrived somewhere they intended to be. Sunday came. Elias came. He arrived in the afternoon properly, with his hair combed and his clothes clean, which she noticed, because it indicated that he understood the seriousness of what he had asked for, and she had put on her better dress and arranged her hair with the pins, which he likely also noticed. They sat on the covered porch she had built on the east side of the house and talked for 3 hours, while the afternoon light moved across the grass, and the cottonwood leaves turned silver in the wind. They talked about Tennessee and Missouri, about the war's long shadow, about cattle and corn, and the particular difficulty of putting down roots in a country that was still being decided. She told him about Thomas, more than she had told anyone, the good parts and the complicated parts, and the specific grief of loving someone who kept things from you because they could not bear to disappoint you. He listened without trying to fix it. He told her about his family, a mother who was still living in Nashville and 2 brothers he had not seen in 4 years, and the complicated relationship he had with the life he had chosen, which had given him freedom and taken away stability, in which he was, at 30 years old, trying to renegotiate. "Do you actually want land?" she asked. "Or does the idea of land feel like a solution to something else?" The question surprised him, she could see it. He was quiet for a while. "Both, probably," he said finally. "I think what I want is to stop moving. I think land is the most literal way I know to accomplish that. But you are right that there is something underneath it that is not purely practical." "What is underneath it?" He looked at her directly. "I want something that means I chose a life rather than just being carried along by one," he said. She nodded. She understood that completely. That was what her land was for her, not just soil and water rights and a deed with her name on it, but evidence that she had made a decision, that she was not simply a person things happened to. He came back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. They fell into a pattern that was, she thought, extremely civilized and also slightly maddening, because she had come to understand that what she felt for Elias Fairchild was not the careful warmth of a new friendship, but something considerably more urgent, which she was managing with great discipline. He was clearly doing the same thing. She could see it in the way he chose his words, the care he took not to presume anything, the quality of his attention when she talked, which was the kind of attention that was actually paying attention and not just waiting for its turn to speak. She liked him, she thought, as much as she had ever liked anyone, and that was separate from and also feeding into the other thing, the thing that was not liking. In late July there was a problem. It was the south fence, the one he had warned her about on the day she first visited the land, which gave way in a section long enough that 3 of the cattle from the Double H Ranch got through and onto her property, and did a considerable amount of damage to the garden she had been growing since May. She came out one morning to find the damage and stood among her ruined bean rows, and felt the very specific fury of watching something you have tended get destroyed. She rode to the Double H Ranch, which was 4 miles north, and found Garrett Holloway at the main house, who was a large, weathered man of about 50 with the bearing of someone who had been running things for a long time and was accustomed to getting his way about them. "Your cattle broke through my south fence," she said, without preamble. "They have destroyed a significant portion of my vegetable garden." Garrett looked at her with the particular expression that men of his type often wore when addressed directly by women, somewhere between surprise and reassessment. "My apologies, Mrs. Covington," he said. "I will have a man repair the fence. As for the garden, I can offer you some supplies from my store. I would rather you offer me the value of what was lost," she said, "and have the fence repaired by the end of the week." He looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Fair enough." She rode back and found Elias at her gate, having apparently ridden down from the north pasture when he saw what had happened. "I am sorry," he said immediately. "That fence has been my responsibility to flag for Garrett, and I should have pushed harder on it earlier. This is partly on me." She looked at him. "I have already been to see Garrett. It is resolved." Something moved through his face, a complicated mix of things she recognized as relief and also a kind of quiet admiration. "Of course you have," he said. "Do not look at me like that," she said, but without particular heat. "Like what? Like I have done something impressive. I simply did what needed doing." "I know," he said. "I am looking at you like that anyway." She felt heat in her face, which was extremely inconvenient, and she turned away from him and went back to assessing the damage so she could make a list of what needed to be replanted. He helped her replant it. He did not ask whether she wanted help. He simply began working alongside her, and she let him because there was too much to do to stand on principle about it, and also because she did not actually want him to leave. They worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, and when the light was finally too low to see well, they sat on the porch steps, and she poured them both water from the pitcher she kept inside. They sat side by side on the steps with their shoulders almost touching and the night coming on across the grass in long purple waves. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I know that you came here to build something for yourself," he said. "And I know that what that means is that this," he gestured between them, not dramatically but with a clear intention, "needs to be something you want for its own sake and not because it makes anything easier. I would not want to be a convenience to you, and I would not want to complicate what you are building." She turned and looked at him. He was looking forward at the grass and the darkening sky, and there was a tension in him she had not seen before, the particular tension of a person who has said something important and is waiting to find out what it costs. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "You are not a convenience," she said, "and you have not complicated anything. You have been, for the past 6 months, the most consistently decent person I have encountered since coming to Kansas, possibly since coming to adulthood. You listen. You do not presume. You told me at the very beginning that you had not earned my trust, and then you spent 6 months quietly earning it, without ever demanding that I acknowledge it or award you anything for it." She paused. "I am not someone who says things I do not mean. So when I tell you that I look forward to Sunday all week, I mean that." He was very still, the way things go still before something happens. "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time, I think. I was not going to say it until you were ready to hear it, and I was not certain when that would be, and I want to be clear that I am not saying it as a demand for anything. I am saying it because it is true, and I have a difficult time continuing not to say things that are true." The night air was warm and smelled of grass and the creek and the particular sweetness of late summer in Kansas, and she looked at his face in the low remaining light and thought about all the ways trust was built, which was slowly and out of small true things accumulated over time until they weighed enough to be certain. "I love you too," she said. "It took me a while to be willing to admit it, even to myself." He let out a breath that had the quality of something that had been held for a long time. Then he took her hand, carefully, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and she let him, and they sat on the porch steps of her house in the dark and held hands in the prairie night, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more for a while. He kissed her for the first time about 20 minutes later, because 20 minutes of sitting in the dark holding hands while clearly thinking about it had established sufficient intention on both sides, and it was not a reckless kiss. It was the kind of kiss that confirmed something that had been building for months, certain and warm and unhurried. She kissed him back with equal certainty, and when they pulled apart she was aware of smiling, which she had not done purely and simply in a very long time. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed, and he was also smiling, that low, surprised version that still managed to look as if he could not quite believe something was this good. He rode home that night under a sky that was extremely generous with stars, which Kansas in August tended to be, and she sat on the porch for another hour watching the sky and thinking about the fact that she was happy, quietly and solidly happy, in a way that did not feel contingent on anything staying perfect. It was not the frantic happiness of relief or the bright happiness of a new beginning. It was the deep, grounded happiness of a person who is exactly where they chose to be. The courtship continued through the summer and into the fall with a progression that felt both natural and inevitable. He came for Sunday visits and she began having a meal ready, because she liked cooking and because feeding someone was one of the oldest forms of saying that you wanted them to stay. He brought her things occasionally, not grand things, a book he had found that he thought she would like, a length of good fabric from a trader passing through, seeds for the next spring's planting. She gave him things too, a mended jacket, a meal packed for him to eat on the trail, on 2 occasions the benefit of her considerable practicality when his own plans needed a more rigorous examination. They talked about everything. She had not known, before this, that it was possible to talk about everything with a man, which probably said something unflattering about the men she had previously been close to. With Elias she found that the conversation never ran out, that there was always another layer of what he thought or what she had noticed, or what the world looked like from a different angle, and the conversations circled back on themselves in the way of conversations with someone who is genuinely interesting to you, which is one of the more reliable signs. October brought the first cold. The house proved itself in the first hard frost, which was a satisfaction she had not anticipated, to lie in bed listening to the wind and feel the walls hold. She added a small iron stove that Burkett at the general store had been willing to sell at a fair price, and the stove made the house warm enough for comfort, and she stacked her wood against the east wall and felt prepared. One Sunday in late October Elias came for dinner, and they sat at her table after the meal with the lamp burning between them, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer does not change anything between us. This is not a demand. It is a question." She looked at him steadily. "Ask it. Will you marry me?" he asked. "I am not asking because I think you need someone. I am asking because I want to build my life alongside yours, and I think the formal asking of this question is the appropriate way to communicate the seriousness of that intention. I have savings enough to buy a parcel adjacent to yours. We would each have our own land and our own names on our own deeds, and anything we build together would be built the same way we built this house, which is together, and with your full say in every decision." She looked at him across the lamp. He had given this enormous thought, she could tell, given thought to the exact words, to the careful construction of the offer that would address her deepest concern, which was the fear of being absorbed, of having fought so hard for her own ground, and then losing it to someone else's life again. He had listened to everything she had told him about who she was and what she was afraid of, and he had built an offer around those things rather than in spite of them. "Yes," she said. He breathed. "Yes." "Yes," she said again, and smiled, and he reached across the table and took her hand the way he always did, carefully and certainly. And she thought about the livery stable in April, and the way he had said that is fair, I have not earned it yet, and thought about all the distance between that moment and this one, which was not a great distance in time but was a very great distance in everything else. They were married in December of 1878 at the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a small building that smelled of pine and candle wax and did its best against the Kansas cold with a wood stove that roared heroically. Mrs. Aldridge was there, and Burkett and his wife, and Hector Torres from the Double H, and Clara Boone, who had come back through Caldwell on her family's return journey and had written ahead to ask if she could attend, and Harriet had written back immediately to say yes. Garrett Holloway came, which surprised her a little, and shook Elia's hand with what appeared to be genuine warmth. She wore her good dress, which she had refashioned with the fabric Elia's had brought her in September, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had gathered and dried in the fall against the possibility of exactly this occasion, because she was, fundamentally, a person who planned ahead. Elias wore a suit that she had later learned he had ridden to Wichita to acquire, which was a significant effort and which moved her more than almost anything else about the day. He looked at her when she walked in with an expression she had never seen on him before, something stripped down to its essentials, unguarded and full. The minister was brief, which she appreciated. When he asked if she took this man, she said yes with the same directness she brought to everything. And when Elias said "I do," his voice was the steadiest thing in the room. He kissed her at the end of the ceremony, and the small congregation of people she had somehow accumulated in 8 months in Kansas made a warm sound, and she thought that this was one of the things frontier towns were surprisingly good at, celebrating the things that were worth celebrating with an uncomplicated joy that more established places had sometimes lost. He had been true to his word about the land. 2 weeks after the wedding, he purchased the adjacent parcel to the north, 7 acres with a second access to the creek, and the deed had his name on it, and her deed had her name on it, and together the combined land was 19 acres of good Kansas soil with reliable water and 2 people who knew how to work it. The winter was hard in the way Kansas winters were hard, which was comprehensive and thorough and without much sentiment. They weathered it. He spent most nights at her house, which was more finished and more warm, and they worked out the rhythms of 2 people sharing space with the same negotiated honesty they had applied to everything else. There were moments of friction, because she had strong opinions about how things should be organized and so did he, and they had to find the language for disagreement that did not involve silence or suppression, which had been her previous experience. She had to learn not to go quiet when she was angry, and he had to learn to ask what she was thinking rather than assuming the quiet meant peace. They had to learn each other the way you learn a language, fully and from the inside, with patience for the mistakes and a genuine desire to understand. Spring came back to Kansas the way it always did, all at once and with considerable enthusiasm. She planted the garden again, larger this time, with the additional seeds she had saved and the ones Elias had contributed, and a particular type of squash she had gotten from a woman in town who had traded it for a day of sowing. He worked his land and she worked hers, and they worked the shared fence line together and ate dinner together every evening and woke up together every morning, and neither of them took this for granted, because they were both people who understood what things cost and what they were worth. In late March she told him she was pregnant. She told him on the porch in the morning, because mornings were when she was most direct. He stopped moving completely, the way he sometimes did when receiving significant information, and then he turned to her and she watched his face do something complicated and complete in about 3 seconds, something that started with shock and moved through an enormous joy and arrived at a tenderness that was so undefended it made her eyes sting. "Harriet," he said. "I know," she said. He came to her and held her with the same deliberateness that characterized everything he did, carefully and entirely, and she held him back, and they stood on the porch in the March morning with the creek running and the cottonwoods just beginning their first tentative green. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Somewhat," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Extremely," he said, "and so glad I cannot hold it in my chest." The pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer, and she worked through most of it because she was herself, and stopping was not a thing she did when she did not absolutely have to. He worried about this in the way he expressed worry, which was practically and without drama. He arranged for a woman named Dr. Margaret Price, who was one of the very few women physicians in the territory and had a practice in a town 15 miles north, to come and see Harriet twice, and he paid for it without consulting her on the expense, which was the one time she was not entirely able to argue with his unilateral decision-making, because she had been wanting to see a doctor and had not known how to arrange it. She told him that, and he nodded with an expression that was not quite smug but in that neighborhood, and she told him the expression was unflattering, and he put it away and went back to being impossible to find fault with. Dr. Price said she was healthy and the baby was well-positioned, and to send word when the labor started. She also told Harriet privately that she was doing remarkably well for a woman farming in Kansas without the support of an extended family, and that her husband clearly understood what kind of woman he had married, which was a particular kind of compliment that Harriet appreciated. Their son was born on the 2nd of October, 1879, in the house they had built together, attended by Dr. Price and Mrs. Aldridge, and a quieter version of Harriet than the usual one, who was discovering that labor was not something you could be characteristically practical about. It was its own country with its own rules, and she traveled through it with the same stubborn determination she brought to everything else, and arrived on the other side with a boy. Elias had been sent outside during the labor because he was not being useful inside, his worry translating into a quality of hovering that Mrs. Aldridge had observed needed to be relocated. He was on the porch when Mrs. Aldridge opened the door and said the baby was here and the mother was well, and she told Harriet later that the sound he made outside was not a word exactly, more like something that words had not been invented for yet. He came in and she was in the bed she had hauled 4 miles in a wagon from Mrs. Aldridge's original room, and she was holding a very small and very red and very astonished-looking person, and she looked up at Elias, who was standing in the doorway of the room he had helped build, looking at her, and the baby with everything he was visible in his face. "Come meet him," she said. He crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and looked at his son with an expression she had never seen before on anyone, the particular overwhelmed wonder of a person who has just encountered something that makes every previous category insufficient. "He is remarkable," Elias said. "He is very small," she said. "He is perfectly sized," Elias said, which made her laugh, which was painful but worth it. They named him James Thomas Fairchild, the Thomas for her first husband, which she had needed to say she wanted, and he had received without a word of hesitation or uncertainty, only a nod that meant, "I understand why and I honor it." James was, from the first, a vocal person with strong opinions about most things, which Harriet found both exhausting and extremely familiar. Elias took to fatherhood with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything, learning the particular language of a very small person with patience and attention, and she watched him with James and felt something that was entirely new, a love for him that was different from the love she had already known, larger and more specific, built from the particular sight of this man, gentle and certain with their child. The winter of 1879 was also hard, but they were better prepared. She had put up more preserves than she had thought she could manage, and the root cellar Elias had dug in September was full, and the house was warm and the stove was reliable, and James, wrapped in a quilt her sister had sent from Missouri, was a radiator of considerable personal warmth all his own. She wrote to her sister more now. The letters were full of things she had not expected to have to describe: the particular color of the Kansas sky in February, the way Elias looked when he was teaching James, at 4 months old, to pay attention to the sound of the wind, as if this were immediately important knowledge. Her sister wrote back that she sounded like herself again, which was the best thing her sister could have said to her. Spring of 1880 came, and the land was showing what it was capable of. The second garden was better than the first. The fence was sound. The small herd of chickens she had started with had increased to a population that required management. Elias had traded some labor with the Double H for a small breeding pair of cattle, which they were keeping on his parcel, and the intention was modest but clear. One morning in April she was in the garden and James was on a blanket nearby, 8 months old and engaged in the serious business of trying to pick up grass, and she looked up from her planting and saw Elias coming across the field from his parcel, walking with that efficient, unhurried stride she knew as completely as she knew her own name. And the sun was on the grass, and the cottonwoods were in their first full green, and the creek was running, and she thought about April of 1878. 2 years ago almost exactly, when she had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed horse with a split lip and $12 sewn into her coat lining. She thought about standing in the livery stable doorway and saying, "I do not trust cowboys." She thought about the look on his face when he said, "That is fair. I have not earned it yet." She watched him walk across the field toward her and her son and her garden and her land in the April morning, and thought that there was not a word large enough for what she felt, or if there was it was probably several words that you had to say together, and even then they would only approximate the thing itself, which was the sum of 2 years of small true things accumulated into something that was both permanent and still growing. He reached her and crouched down next to James and said something to James that made James grab his finger with both hands and regard him with enormous seriousness, and Elias looked up at her with a smile that was still slightly surprised, still slightly unable to believe that something was this good, and she smiled back in the way that she had learned was only for him. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She went back to her planting, and he took James and walked along the fence line speaking quietly to him about the state of the posts, which James attended to with rapt incomprehension, and she listened to his voice in the morning air, and planted her seeds in the dark Kansas soil, and felt the full and uncomplicated weight of a life that was hers. Over the next 2 years the land continued to prove itself, and so did they. There were hard seasons. A dry summer in 1880 that threatened the corn before a late rain saved it. A bout of illness that went through the household in the winter of 1881 and kept them both down for 2 weeks, in which Mrs. Aldridge, who was 63 years old and apparently indestructible, came out and kept the house and looked after James with the authority of someone who had been managing things longer than most people had been alive. There were arguments, genuine ones, about money and timing, and the specific question of how much risk was reasonable when you were building something that mattered. She won most of them, which she attributed to being right, and he attributed to her being more stubborn, and the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. But there were also mornings when the light was exactly right, and the whole world seemed to be in agreement with itself, and evenings when dinner ran long because they were still talking and James was asleep in his corner, and the lamp was low, and there was nowhere else either of them would rather have been, and Sunday mornings when she lay in bed and listened to Elias making breakfast in the other room and heard James babbling conversation at him, and felt that she had built, out of the most difficult materials, something genuinely good. Elias had saved steadily through all of it. He had continued working part-time for Garrett Holloway through the first years, gradually reducing his hours as their own land became more productive, and by the spring of 1882 he told Garrett he was done, which was the moment he had been working toward for years, the moment he was not a cowboy working someone else's land but a man who answered only to his own soil. He told Harriet about it on the porch that evening, and she listened and nodded and said, "How does it feel?" He thought about it for a moment. "Like something is finally the right shape," he said. She understood exactly what he meant. James was 2.5 by then, and had developed a personality that was approximately equal parts Harriet's directness and Elia's steadiness, which was a combination that kept them both on their toes. He had opinions about his boots and strong preferences about which songs were acceptable at bedtime, and an absolute and total devotion to the roan horse, which Elias had named Marshall, and which James referred to as Shall with a confidence that suggested he found the full name unnecessarily long. In the summer of 1882, she told Elias she was pregnant again. This time she told him in the morning as well, because mornings were still when she was most direct, but this time she told him in bed, because they were both awake early and the light was just beginning and James was still asleep and the world was quiet. He turned and looked at her in the early light with the same expression he had worn the first time, the enormous unguarded joy that he could not seem to modulate when it came to matters of this particular significance. "Again," he said. "Again," she agreed. "Remarkable," he said. "Biological," she said. He laughed the low, surprised version, and she smiled against his shoulder. Their daughter was born in February of 1883, in the same bed in the same house, attended by Dr. Price, who made the journey again without complaint, and who seemed, by this point, to regard the Fairchilds as something between patients and friends. She was smaller than James had been, with Harriet's dark hair already visible and Elias' brown eyes, and Elias held her for the first time with the same specific overwhelmed wonder he had brought to holding James, and Harriet watched him and thought that this was one of the things she had not known was possible to have again, not only love but the expansion of love, the way it did not divide when there was more to love but simply grew larger to accommodate. They named her Ruth Eleanor Fairchild. Ruth for Elias' mother, Eleanor for no one in particular except that it was a good name, and she deserved one. James, at 3 years old, regarded his sister with suspicion for approximately 4 days, and then with a proprietary devotion that was both touching and occasionally alarming. He wanted to hold her at all times, and had to be negotiated with, which was, Harriet reflected, already preparing him for a life with people who had their own opinions. By the summer of 1883, the Fairchild land, the combined 19 acres that was both Harriet's and Elias and both of theirs together, was producing enough to be comfortable in a way that was real and not aspirational. The garden was established and generous. The small herd had grown to 6 cattle, which were Elias' domain and well managed. The chickens were numerous and productive. She had started selling eggs and preserved goods in Caldwell, which Burkett stocked at the general store, and the income was modest but reliable. She was known in Caldwell by this point, not as the widow woman who had ridden in on a borrowed horse in 1878, though that story had circulated in the affectionate way of small towns with small histories, but as Harriet Fairchild, who grew the best beans in the county, and was not someone you brought a half-measure argument to. She was on the founding committee of the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society, which was not as genteel as it sounded, being primarily concerned with organizing practical assistance for families in difficulty. And she had pushed, with limited but real success, for the society to include women of different backgrounds than its founding membership, because she had seen enough of what isolation cost. Elias was known as a man who kept his word and knew how to build things and was married to Harriet Fairchild, which was itself a form of credential. He was quiet in the way that was not absence but presence, and people sought his opinion on practical matters and trusted what he said. They were, in the estimation of most of Caldwell, Kansas, among the more solid couples in the territory, which was a distinction that both of them wore without particular self-consciousness, because they had not built it for the sake of the estimation. One evening in September of 1883, when the children were both asleep, and the air was doing the September thing in Kansas of cooling fast and smelling of change, Harriet and Elias sat on the porch in the 2 chairs he had built that summer, good sturdy chairs with armrests that she had told him when he was building them that if he made them uncomfortable she would not sit in them, and which he had therefore made extremely comfortable. They were not talking, just sitting, with the stars coming up one by one and the grass dark and the creek sound rising in the evening quiet. She had her hands in her lap and he had his elbow on the armrest and his chin on his hand, looking at the sky, and she was looking at the profile of his face and thinking that she knew it as well as she knew her own, the particular line of the jaw, the way the bridge of his nose had a slight irregularity from some old break he had told her about once, the eyelashes that their daughter had apparently inherited. "Do you remember," she said, "the livery stable?" He turned to look at her. He did not need her to specify. "I remember," he said. "I told you I did not trust cowboys," she said. "You did," he said, "and you were right to say it. And you said," she continued, "that it was fair because you had not earned it yet." "I did," he said. She looked at him in the September dark. "I have thought about that many times," she said. "The way you said it, it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in years, maybe longer." He was quiet for a moment. "I just meant it," he said. "I did not have a strategy about it." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it was honest." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, which had become such a common thing between them that she no longer had to think about whether to let him. Her hand simply met his. "Did I earn it?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that was still careful, still the same quality of caring she had first heard in the livery stable, the understanding that some things needed to be asked even when you thought you knew the answer, because the asking mattered. She squeezed his hand. "Elias," she said, "you have been earning it every single day. That is not past tense. That is present tense. That is every morning you show up and every hard conversation we have and every time you listen when you would rather have a simpler answer. That is what earned means. It is not a destination, it is a practice." He was quiet for a long time, and she could feel through his hand the quality of what that meant to him, the particular stillness of a person who has been given something they needed very much. "I love you," he said, unreasonably and completely. "I love you," she said, "with the entirety of whatever it is that I am." The stars were fully out by now, all of them, the whole enormous Kansas sky doing what it did best in September, which was being frank about the scale of things. The children were asleep inside. The creek was running. The cottonwood trees were dark against the darker sky. The land was theirs. In the morning they would get up and work it and feed their children and build whatever needed building and repair, whatever needed repairing and argue about whatever needed arguing and sit on this porch again in the evening. And this would continue. Not because life was simple or because they had been lucky in any straightforward sense, but because they had chosen, both of them, with full knowledge of the cost, to build something together. In the years that followed, the Fairchild land continued to grow and change. By 1885, they had added a proper barn, built with help from half the county over the course of a long summer weekend that had turned into a celebration, and had involved Mrs. Aldridge's cooking and Hector Torr's guitar and James, 6 years old by then, learning what a barn raising was and understanding it as one of the things that made a community. Ruth, at 2, regarded the whole event with the same dark-eyed assessment her mother brought to new situations, which Elias found enormously amusing. Elias had been right that he wanted to stop moving. He had not moved in 7 years, which was the longest he had stayed anywhere since leaving Tennessee, and each year the land was more his, not in the legal sense but in the sense of knowing where every stone was, and where the soil changed, and which section of fence always needed attention in the spring thaw. He was a farmer by then, not a cowboy, and the transition had been so gradual and so natural that he could not have said exactly when one had ended and the other had begun. Harriet was, by 1885, a woman who had arrived somewhere she recognized as herself, which was different from the woman who had ridden into Caldwell 7 years before, though the bones of her were the same. She was less defended, not because the world had become less difficult, but because she had accumulated enough evidence of what it felt like to be truly known by another person that she had relaxed something deep inside herself that had been tightly clenched since Thomas died. She was not fearless. She had never been fearless, but the fear was now in its right proportion to the rest of what she was. She had trusted a cowboy. He had earned it, as he had said he would, and continued earning it in the daily accumulation of small true things that was a real life. Not a grand gesture, not a single dramatic proof, but the steady patient work of being someone consistently, day after day, in the good seasons and the hard ones. And in the mornings in Kansas, when the light came in through the east window that she had insisted on and fell across the floor, she had first swept with hope and was now worn smooth with years of use. And the smell of coffee came from the other room, and the sound of her children's voices started up in the early morning way of children who woke ready for the day. She lay in the warmth and thought that she had not known. When she rode into Caldwell with a split lip and a borrowed horse and exactly $12 sewn into her coat, that this was what was coming toward her on the other side of all her difficulty. She had not known, but she had not stopped moving either. She had ridden forward, into the town and the land office and the livery stable and the hard, honest conversation and the porch in the rain and the question about whether she would let him try to earn it. And all of that forward motion had brought her here, to this morning, to this light, to this life. She could hear Elias in the kitchen, the particular sounds of him, the specific way he moved through a morning, and she listened to it the way she listened to the creek, as part of the permanent music of the world she lived in. James ran through the hall yelling something about Marshall the horse, and Ruth's voice rose in response, not to be left out of whatever was happening, and Harriet Fairchild lay in her bed on her land in Kansas in the particular light of a morning in 1885 and smiled at the ceiling and thought, yes, this is it. This is exactly the thing. She got up. She went to the kitchen. She kissed her husband on the jaw as she passed him, which made him smile without looking up from the coffee he was pouring, and she opened the back door and let the morning in, the enormous wide-open Kansas morning, all sky and grass and the sound of the creek, and the smell of the land that was hers, that was theirs, that was the truest thing she had ever built.